Hello there everyone, and welcome to 120 Tips and Exploits for Live MTTs. My name is Matt Hunt with Poker Fluency. Hopefully you're already familiar with me from my work on sites like GTO Wizard, Solve4White TV, Tournament Poker Edge, and Pocket Fives Training. But if you're not familiar, I've been a professional poker player for about 14 years now as of 2025, and I've been coaching for about 12 of those years. I've done roughly 4,000 hours of one-to-one coaching sessions with at least 250 students, as well as a whole bunch of in-person classroom sessions with groups, and of course, a lot of content creation for those various sites that I just mentioned. I really appreciate you signing up for Poker Fluency, and I hope you'll continue to get a lot of value out of this and all the other content you're going to see going forward from me. So without any further ado, let's dive into our 120 tips and exploits. And the structure for this is going to be pretty fluid. We're just going to go through them one by one. They're not organized in a specific kind of a structure, so we will jump around a little bit, but hopefully we're just going to be able to rattle off some really useful pieces of advice for everybody. And we're going to start with the early stages of the tournament. So let's dive right in. Tip number 1, at passive tables, size your opens larger to compensate for the lack of 3-betting. You're not going to see players doing a lot of 3-betting, so your strong hands need to grow the pot by raising to larger sizes. Number 2, at tables that are heavy on recreational players, open a slightly tighter range in early position to compensate for less fold equity, but don't go too tight. Hands like ace-8 suited and pocket fives are still mandatory opens from early position in most environments, even if you are using a bigger open size. Number 3, you're going to want to 3-bet a strong, linear, high equity range of good suited hands and good pocket pairs to account for the fact that your 3-bets in the early stages are not going to get as many folds. Hands like suited broadways become mandatory 3-bets in a lot of these environments. Number 4, you're going to want to 3-bet with larger sizings than normal to ensure being able to grow the pot with your value hands and compensate for the fact that your opponents are not going to 4-bet you very much. Number 5, you'll want to prioritize asking the question of, can I get value from worse hands when you're 3-betting here? Because ultimately, when you're constructing your 3-bet range in a linear way, the majority of your hands are going to be value hands that want to get called. That doesn't mean they're exclusively very strong hands. It just means that the majority of your value is coming from getting called by worse and not from getting certain hands to fold. Number 6, recognize that suited connector hands actually realize equity very well in 3-bet pots, and they're going to add a lot of board coverage to your range to make sure that you can still have good hands in 3-bet pots on lower card board textures. So 3-betting these hands is very reasonable even if you are 3-betting a pretty linear pre-flop range. You can 3-bet a hand like 6-5 suited, 7-6 suited, even if you know you're not going to get very many folds, simply because those hands realize equity so well at deep stacks. Number 7, your suited broadways and strong offsuit aces, so ace-10 off through ace-queen off, are the hands that benefit the most from your opponent's lower 4-bet frequencies in the early stages. So be sure to 3-bet these hands at a pretty high rate, maybe not so much the ace-10 offs and the ace-jack offs, but certainly your stronger suited hands. Those are going to really benefit from not getting 4-bet, and they become mandatory 3-bets, as we've mentioned. Number 8, when facing 3-bets, be very conservative with your calling ranges, especially with middle card suited hands, which are easily dominated by a value-only 3-bet range. So a hand like Jack-10 suited, 10-9 suited may actually not be doing that well if your opponent's 3-bet range is composed of mostly strong pocket pairs. Number 9, if your opponent happens to 3-bet on the smaller side, don't fall into the trap of automatically calling with your entire opening range, because you're likely up against a value-only 3-bet range. So a lot of your offsuit hands in particular are going to play very poorly at depth against that range. You do have to be mindful, even against a small 3-bet, of how your hand is actually going to play across 3 streets at depth. Number 10, if you do raise and get flatted and then face a squeeze, be very conscious of whether or not you actually have position against the player who's squeezing. This is going to matter a lot more than the presence of additional players behind you. If you're in position against the player who's squeezing, you might consider having a calling range. If you're out of position and there's a player behind or more than one player behind, you may want to play 4-bet or fold in those spots because calling is really unlikely to put you in good spots post-flop, multi-way, first to act. Number 11, when facing a raise and multiple calls, squeeze aggressively with large sizings and a linear range of hands. Any suited Broadway is going to be a very effective squeezing hand in these spots. They block the calling hands. They play very well if they do get called. And of course, they're doing very well against a lot of the pocket pairs that are also in the calling ranges as well. Number 12, just because a player only 3-bets for value doesn't mean you can't 4-bet bluff against them. They may never fold to your 4-bet pre-flop, but they'll likely be flatting your 4-bet with a very narrow and condensed range, a lot of which may not be able to tolerate significant post-flop pressure. So if you do think your opponent is 3-betting hands like 9s, 10s, jacks for value, and then potentially going to be in some trouble if they face a 4-bet, you can actually still get away with 4-bet bluffs, even if they have no bluffs in their range pre-flop. Number 13, suited ace hands actually function slightly worse as squeezes in many spots, because hands like ace queen off, ace jack off, even ace 10 off in some spots are going to fold less often than what they're actually supposed to. If your opponents are more passive, they're going to have more ace hands that are actually dominating your ace that you squeeze with. So you do need to be mindful that it's the stronger aces, the stronger suited and offsuit aces that prefer to squeeze, and not so much the ace 5 suiteds, ace 4 suiteds, and so on. Number 14, when you're at deep stacks and you're facing limpers, use a large raise sizing of at least 5 big blinds with a linear but a fairly wide range. Middling suited hands like queen 8 suited or king 5 suited can be reasonable candidates to attack limpers in a lot of spots, because that range is so weak and it's really rarely going to play back at you aggressively, and that's a good thing. We don't care if our opponent calls and plays passively. What we care about is facing aggression, and that's going to happen very rarely when you're facing limpers. Number 15, if you 3-bet and you get cold called by a player that's not yet in the pot, the range is going to be heavily condensed around hands like 8s through jacks, ace queen suited, ace jack suited, king queen suited, etc. Although some splashier players will cold call any pair to set mine. But be aware that you're not especially likely to face traps in the early stages. Just because your opponent cold calls your 3-bet doesn't mean they're automatically guaranteed to be trapping. Number 16, if you do face a cold call, be mindful of which position it comes from, because even though cold calling from out of position is an even bigger mistake than doing it from in position, cold calls from the big blind or even from the small blind will actually come from slightly wider ranges, since a lot of recreational players will recognize that they're technically getting a slightly better price. So they might have pairs from the big blind that they wouldn't cold call from the button, for example. Number 17, don't c-bet too often against these cold callers. Their range is strong enough that they're going to have pretty good equity on most board textures, and you won't get a lot of immediate folds on the flop. So if you are going to c-bet, you have to be willing to follow that up with aggression on future streets. If they have jacks, 10s, etc., they may not immediately fold to a c-bet on an ace-high flop, but they probably will fold if they face multiple barrels. So be ready to fire those barrels if need be. Number 18, in blind versus blind spots, almost nobody is going to attack your small blind limps wide enough or aggressively enough in the early stages. This means you should almost never fold any hand if it folds to you in the small blind. And against many players, it can be fine to raise the top 30 or 40% of hands and just limp the rest, because they're not really going to recognize that your limping range is a lot weaker than your raising range. Number 19, a lot of players will almost always 4-bet queens plus or ace king facing a 3-bet, which means their calling ranges versus the 3-bet will almost never include these hands. Occasionally they'll 4-bet queens or ace king at depth without a plan of how to respond to a 5-bet. So small 5-bets with ace blocker hands can sometimes be very effective. So just be aware overall of the consequences later on in the hand of what happens if they never flat a 3-bet with queens or ace king, or aces or kings. Number 20, players will usually be opening slightly too tight for each position. So assume each opening range is maybe 1 or even 2 positions tighter. For example, treat a button open as if it's a cutoff opening range, or treat a hijack open like a low jack opening range. This can help you to formulate the right strategies, particularly from the big blind when everybody else has folded. Number 21, against large open raise sizes, reduce your calling frequency but continue to 3-bet aggressively, since there's now more money out there to win. However, be mindful that large opens will often come from a very tight range that won't often fold to a 3-bet. So you have to balance the two things out there. You don't want to flat a lot. You want a 3-bet to take that pot down, but if it's a very tight range, you might not take it down very often. Number 22, when in the big blind facing a raise and multiple calls, be very mindful of not calling too wide. Your calling range multi-way should always be tighter than what it is heads up, not wider. Offsuit hands in particular are going to play very poorly out of position versus multiple players, and all your hands are going to realize less equity the more players are in the hand, especially when you're out of position. Number 23, your opponent's big blind 3-bet ranges are generally going to be very value heavy because a lot of players will just be happy to call with most hands when they're getting a good price instead of aggressively seeking to find those 3-bet bluffs. So be aware that when you do face a big blind 3-bet, your opponent's going to miss a lot of bluffing opportunities, and they're really only going to 3-bet the strongest hands at a high frequency. Number 24, small 3-bets, so less than 3 times the open size in general, from the big blind are going to be extremely strong to the point where they're heavily weighted towards having pocket aces a lot of the time. The reason people do this is they size small from out of position because they don't want you to fold. They hate 3-betting aces and getting a fold, but they also don't recognize that they're missing so many 3-bet bluff spots in that circumstance that in the end, the only hand that actually gets to the point of wanting to 3-bet small from the big blind is quite often going to be aces. So you should be very reluctant to call these 3-bets, and when you do, it should be hands that specifically can play fairly well and flop well against aces exactly. Number 25, when you're the first or second player into the pot, don't be too concerned about the possibility of a multi-way pot, because if your opponents are going to call with too many trashy hands, that's a good thing. We want that to happen. So before they actually call, don't pay too much attention to them. If they're going to make a bunch of mistakes, let them do it. Just focus on your ranges, and particularly if you're the second player into the pot, focus on the range of the pre-flop raiser, because that's the most important thing. Number 26, pay close attention to how everyone at your table physically handles their chips and cards. The easiest way to immediately spot recreational players is by noting anyone who seems to be handling their chips or cards in an awkward or clumsy way, since they'll likely be a less experienced poker player overall. Number 27, if a player appears clumsy when handling chips or nervous overall, but is under the age of 35 and seems to make good decisions when they're actually playing hands, there's a high likelihood this player is an online regular, possibly even an online pro, who simply doesn't play a lot of live poker. So you should treat those players a little bit differently than someone in an older age bracket who is less comfortable handling chips, because they are more likely to be a pure recreational player. Number 28, assume all post-flop aggression in multi-way pots is weighted towards value until a showdown tells you otherwise. A lot of your weak one-pair bluff catchers, which can very rarely improve, have very limited value when facing a bet into a multi-way pot. So there are plenty of situations where top pair, middle pair, bottom pair, those types of hands that don't really improve very well actually will want to fold with multiple players left to act in a multi-way pot. Number 29, assume check raises in the early stages are value, especially from recreational players. The check raise bluffs they do find will usually be draws, meaning their check raising ranges are often going to be very linear and not very polarized as they should be in some cases. They're going to have a range of value and then good equity draws. You're not going to be playing very well against that range with a bluff catcher. Number 30, in events with re-entry, players will be a lot more willing to gamble it up by putting a lot of chips in with draws on earlier streets. Fast playing big hands becomes very important during this portion of these events. You're going to get a lot more value in re-entry events by just making sure you get chips in on the flop and banking on players not folding their draws. Number 31, similarly, most players are going to be unafraid of bluff catching rivers in the early stages, especially in re-entry tournaments. This is even more true when the number of chips they're actually risking isn't hugely significant. So consider reducing your river bluffing frequencies, especially on blank river cards where turn bluff catchers didn't decrease in value. There will be spots where a river brick leads to a big bluff catch from a recreational player because they just think, if I'm wrong, I can just rebuy. Number 32, when a pot starts multi-way and then goes heads up on a later street, the betting range of the aggressive player is likely a lot stronger than it would usually be if the pot had started heads up. So if you're the defender, your response versus turn and river aggression should be a lot tighter and less aggressive than it would be in the equivalent heads up spot. Number 33, when you're considering your river bluff catching principles in situations where the hand started out multi-way, just be aware that in keeping with the fact that your opponents are likely to be value heavy on the earlier streets in these multi-way situations, they're unlikely to be able to get to the river with a lot of bluff candidates in these spots either. So you should be very reluctant to bluff catch rivers in the same way that we're continuing tighter on the earlier streets as well. Number 34, on flops with very few draws, for example, ace-9 for rainbow, king-7 deuce rainbow, etc., assume that recreational players will find very few check raises and almost no check raise bluffs. They're really going to struggle to identify what bluffs they should use there when there aren't really any draws available to them. Number 35, versus value-heavy check-raising ranges, you should be more willing to continue with hands that have the ability to immediately draw out against the value range of the raiser. For example, if the flop is Jack, Jack, 10, then any pocket pair might actually be a better continuing hand than 10x, since 10x has no outs against a Jack, but a pocket pair has 2 clean outs to a full house. Number 36, overbet lines from recreational players are likely to be heavily underbluffed in most cases, although you will see these lines pretty rarely. In most cases, it's just a big hand seeking to play a big pot. Number 37, by contrast, overbets from pros will sometimes be slightly overbluffed. So it can actually sometimes be a good idea to bluff catch more aggressively against bigger sizings from pros than you would against smaller sizings. Number 38, turn and river check raises in the early stages will usually be very strong and heavily underbluffed. This is simply because people are kind of autopiloting a little bit early on, and they're not usually putting that much thought and effort into aggressively trying to find bluffs on the later streets. Number 39, if you face a large bet size on a monotone flop, especially in a multi-way pot, be very conservative with the hands you decide to call with. Top pair with no flush draw can actually be a very bad continuing hand if your opponent's betting range is mostly composed of value hands and high equity flush draws. Number 40, assume that flop check raises in 3-bet pots from recreational players will be extremely value heavy. At deep stacks, even calling a flop raise with an overpair might actually be a mistake in a lot of spots. Number 41, similarly, be aware that automatically c-betting all your overpairs on dangerous boards in 3-bet pots can actually get you into a lot of trouble. If the flop comes 8-7-6 with a flush draw, hands like aces and kings will actually be heavily incentivized to check back at deeper stacks. Number 42, most recreational players are going to be unwilling to check strong hands on the turn. They're too afraid of losing value. The only exception is going to be when their hand has the board locked down, such as a flopped full house, and they're trying to wait for you to catch up in some capacity. So when you do see them check more than once, particularly if they check back in position on the turn, you should assume their ranges are very capped. Number 43, when a recreational player check calls the flop and check calls the turn, then donk bets on a river brick, this will quite often be a value hand that was afraid that you would fold if they raised on an earlier street, but then didn't want to risk having you check behind on the river. And quite often these donk bets will be relatively small in size. When that happens, they're doing it because they want to ensure getting some kind of payoff. So we should call very conservatively here. Number 44, by contrast, a hand which check calls twice and then finds a river donk bet when the river is not a brick, such as when a flush draw or straight draw completes, that will actually be a bluff a little bit more often than you might expect. Your opponent doesn't want to check the river and risk facing a bet, so they decide to turn their top pair or middle pair into a weird, nonsensical bluff. We might refer to this as a panic bluff, where they just don't know what else to do, so they bet or even shove all in. And it's quite common on flush completing rivers from some players. Number 45, it's generally safe to assume that most pros will prioritize fast playing their value hands at this stage of the event, just like we talked about earlier on, since they know they're playing against weaker, more passive opponents on average. If a pro perceives you to be a recreational player, they're likely to be somewhat more capped when they take passive lines against you, leaving them more vulnerable to your aggression. And number 46, if you're a recreational player, think about the average types of weaknesses that exist within the recreational player pool at your stakes, and then try to ensure that your own leaks don't match up with those leaks. Because the easiest way to guarantee being exploited by pros is to make the same mistakes as all the other recreational players. That way they can implement their normal exploitative strategies with no problems. Number 47 is that players tend to play chip EV strategies for far too long in certain events, not recognizing that there's a slight ICM influence as soon as registration closes, but only a small one. However, once they do shift to thinking about ICM, they tend to radically overcompensate and play far too tight. So they tend to have a binary mindset of chip EV or ICM, and they can't really blend the two very well. Number 48, the vast majority of recreational players and some pros are going to radically overvalue a 25 to 40 big blind stack during the middle stages and generally play far too conservatively with that stack. If your opponent's sitting on around average stack or below, you should expect their 3-bet bluffing frequencies to be a lot lower than optimal, and generally their ranges are going to be a bit too tight. Number 49, adjusting your opening ranges during this phase is quite tricky, because if your opponents are playing a good chip EV strategy, they're going to be flatting more often, which means we actually have to tighten up relative to what ICM would normally tell us. If they're playing a bad chip EV strategy that's too tight, then actually it matches quite well with what ICM would tell them to do, so we can actually continue opening a little bit wider. Number 50, towards the end of day one play in these middle stages, look out for players who are obviously fatigued or not paying full attention, especially players who are maybe in the older age brackets. These players are generally going to have tighter ranges, play more straightforwardly, and be less likely to find unusual bluffs if they are maybe not at full capacity in terms of mental energy. But they're also less likely to be capable of making big folds when under pressure, because they might simply not think too hard about it and hit that call button, so to speak. Number 51, when responding versus an open raise from a tougher opponent, be aware that most pros will be taking into account how soft the event is when considering their call-off ranges versus an all-in shove, for example. If the event is very soft and the structure is good, and you have the opportunity to put a big portion of their stack at risk, you might actually get more folds than usual by targeting the tougher players, especially if you are perceived to be a recreational player yourself. Number 52, the previous point we made about energy levels will also be true to some extent right after the dinner break. Players who maybe ate too much on dinner break might be tired and inattentive right afterwards. So you should avoid eating too much on dinner for this reason. But be mindful that other players, particularly pros or players who obviously prioritize their physical health and well-being, will likely come back from dinner break with more energy and maybe a slightly better attention span. So those are the players you might want to target right before the break hits and not afterwards. Number 53, once you get down below the 40 to 50 big blind region, 3-bet bluffing from the big blind with offsuit ace and king blocker hands will be a very powerful weapon. Your opponents will likely assume this line to be heavily underbluffed and will probably fold a lot. But be careful to use the correct sizings and 3-bet to somewhere between 8 big blinds and 12 big blinds depending on the size of the open raise and the stacks. Number 54, shoving all in versus an open raise should be something you do quite often, even from a 25 big blind or 30 big blind stack, and especially with suited Broadway hands which block the top hands in the deck, but also have great equity when they get called. Number 55, a very useful hack for calling all-in shoves is that if you're confident that your opponent is definitely jamming the hand 1 pip lower than your hand, then your hand is probably a call. If there's a small risk premium, a little bit of ICM in play, then make it 2 pips lower. Or for a large risk premium, maybe make it 3 pips lower. So if we have pocket 9s, then we should call off if we're confident villain is jamming with pocket 8s. And with ICM, we would need them to be jamming pocket 7s or even 6s as well to compensate for that risk premium. Number 56, when 1 or more callers are in the pot, you can shove for a greater number of big blinds. As a rule of thumb, you can shove for anywhere up to around 10 times the pot if the spot is right. And if the shove is only for around 5 to 7 times the pot, then you should definitely have a reasonably aggressive shoving range. A bit like if you were open shoving 12.5 big blinds into a starting pot of 2.5. That's 5 times the pot, but we do that all the time. Number 57, against larger open sizes, your threshold for how many chips you're willing to shove should increase. If your opponent opens to 3 big blinds, you might be very comfortable reshoving for 30 to 35 big blinds, even without any callers in the pot. Number 58, when playing blind versus blind at medium stack sizes, you should expect the average recreational player to be checking far too often in the big blind after you limp in the small blind. and raising a very linear range of mostly pretty good hands. As a result, you should be doing a fair amount of limp folding when they do raise without worrying too much about being exploited for that. Number 59. By contrast with this, when you're in the big blind and you face a small blind limp, recognize that even against a perfect opponent, your big blind raise frequency should usually be above 40%, with a very diverse range of hands. Against many players, you can get away with attacking their limps even more aggressively than this. Number 60. Players who open limp outside of the small blind at medium stack sizes are often divided into two categories. The ones who are open limping because they're trying to see as many flops as possible, and the ones who are open limping for some kind of deceptive purpose because they're planning to limp shove all in. Telling the difference between these two can be tough, but be aware that limp re-raise bluffs are extremely uncommon, so it's pretty safe to assume your opponent is trapping if that does happen. Number 61, be aware that small to medium pocket pairs play very awkwardly as raises versus limpers, unless stacks are very deep. When you're in the middle stages, your raising ranges versus limpers should be composed of a lot of high card and middle card suited hands, and your pairs and smaller suited connectors will prefer to limp behind or possibly fold. Number 62, when in the big blind at shallow stack sizes of less than 20 big blinds, remember that your big blind defense frequency should go up as you get shallower, not down. It's easier to realize equity across multiple streets with shallower stacks than it is with deep stacks. And number 63, on that same theme, be aware that you can defend your big blind against a raise even at very shallow stacks. If you're facing a 2 big blind raise and you have, say, 5 big blinds in your stack, there's no reason to think you have to just play shove or fold from the big blind. Calling the raise and deciding based on the flop whether you flop equity or not is a very reasonable and logical play. Number 64, the same also applies to some extent in the small blind. Once you get below 10 big blinds, shoving pre-flop over a raise is unlikely to get a fold very often, but you will be able to realize some equity by calling and seeing a flop, even if the big blind overcalls. As a result, many suited middle card hands which can flop fairly well will actually be a call in the small blind, even off a stack of between 5 and 10 big blinds. Number 65, expect pre-flop 3-betting ranges at medium stack sizes to be too linear in nature. Players are inclined to 3-bet hands like king-queen suited or pocket nines without any kind of a plan of what to do versus a 4-bet or a shove. Pay close attention to any time you see a player do this because it means they're probably not constructing their 3-bet ranges very well. Number 66. This last one also applies to 4-bets. Sometimes players will be afraid of flatting 3-bets, so they'll 4-bet with a hand like ace-queen suited or pocket jacks, and then have no idea what they're going to do if they get 5-bet jammed on. So in these cases, 5-bet jamming hands like ace-5 suited can still have some benefits for this reason, because even if your opponent is never actually 4-bet bluffing, you can punish them heavily if they're 4-betting some of these medium value hands and then folding them to a shove. Number 67, the point at which most players will start adapting to the approaching bubble will usually be at the last break before the bubble bursts. They'll usually get caught up in the action prior to that and won't necessarily stop themselves to think about altering their strategy. But when the break happens, they'll have a moment to think things through, and they'll usually alter how they play right afterwards as a result. Number 68, when you see a recreational player flat call a raise from a very short stack in a spot where they shouldn't really have a calling range, like 12 big blinds or so, don't automatically assume it's a trap. Usually it's exactly what it seems like. It's a hand that doesn't want to shove, but doesn't want to fold. Number 69, on the other hand, when you see a pro calling in a spot where it seems unusual, such as cold calling a 3-bet or flatting off a very shallow stack outside of the big blind, it's much more likely to be a trap. They're doing it because they just assume that you're not going to be able to figure out that they're always trapping in that spot. Number 70, if you're at a table with a variety of player types, your approach against an open raise should be geared towards encouraging the weakest players into the pot. For example, if a tough pro open raises, even a hand which would normally 3-bet could be much more profitable as a flat call if the players in the blinds are weaker than average and will make a lot of mistakes post-flop if you go multi-way. Number 71, at medium stacks, you'll often see players neglecting to pay attention to stack sizes and 4-betting to 35 to 50% of the effective stack. Recognize that when they do this, it's almost never going to be with the intention of folding to a shove. When you see a 4-bet that's so big your opponent can never fold if you shove, you should treat it as if they had shoved, but with a slightly stronger range. Number 72, there are many spots where aces is not supposed to shove all in pre-flop versus a 3-bet or 4-bet. It's either supposed to make a small, non-all-in re-raise, or it's supposed to just flat call to protect your flatting range. It's extremely common, however, for recreational players to just shove all in with aces instead. And this means that some of the hands, like ace-king or pocket jacks, might actually be in much worse shape against the shoving range than you would expect. Number 73, since you'll be playing more heads-up pots in these middle stages, in particular, note any pros who seem to be range betting all flops from in position, so that you can start check raising them much more aggressively from the big blind. Number 74, a lot of recreational players will see bet certain flops far too frequently from out of position. In particular, board textures which seem like they don't connect with our flatting range very much, but in fact are actually quite good for our pocket pairs. Something like an 8-3 deuce rainbow or 10 deuce deuce rainbow are boards where our opponent actually shouldn't be c-betting that often from out of position if we're flatting with a reasonable range. But a lot of recreational players will effectively range bet these boards without thinking too hard about it. And we can raise quite aggressively against these range bets if we know when these opponents are doing it. Number 75, in this phase of the event after registration closes, players are a lot more inclined to avoid bluff catching when it's for their tournament life. They may also be inclined to overfold in situations where we're risking our own tournament life by bluffing, since they project their own risk-averse tendencies onto their opponents. Number 76, after defending the big blind against a raise, your donk bet frequency on low card flop textures that feature 3 cards to a straight should be relatively high. In particular, pay attention to any spot where you can have the straight, but the pre-flop raiser can't. Something like a 7-6-4 flop as opposed to a 7-6-5, for example. Number 77, when facing a raise and a call from the big blind, even a small amount of ICM pressure can be significant, especially if both opponents cover us. Our calling range should be substantially tighter in these spots than it usually would be in chip EV. Number 78, when we're the covering stack in the big blind, we do have more freedom to call. However, we should be aware that both the opening range and the calling range are likely to be tighter than usual, so we still end up calling a slightly tighter range than we would in chip EV. Number 79, on highly dynamic flop textures with many draws, recreational players' raising or check raising ranges will often be composed of only value hands and high equity draws. When this is the case, we mostly have an incentive to decide on the flop whether or not our hand is good enough to play an all-in pot. Hands which aren't strong enough to be all-in don't generally benefit from calling and seeing one more street against a strong range that's going to be able to play an all-in pot on the next street anyway. Number 80, if you open raise and get defended by a big blind player with a shallow stack, recognize that there will be many flops where range betting actually isn't a good idea. The big blind is supposed to donk bet fairly often at a low SPR like that, but since they mostly won't do this, we actually get more opportunities to check back on the bad flops, which are usually the ones heavier on middle cards, and just realize some equity with those broadways and ace highs in our range. Number 81, players who call a pre-flop raise, whether recreational players or pros, will usually struggle to find enough flop bluffs when checked to by the pre-flop raiser, but they won't struggle to identify value hands. This means that they're generally weighted towards value, and even though we don't have to be especially conservative, we should be cautious if they bet multiple streets as the pre-flop caller. Number 82, on the other hand, when a pre-flop caller checks behind on the flop, they're usually extremely capped, and quite often they will never have better than top pair, and we can apply significant pressure to this range across the turn and river. Very large turn bets as the out of position pre-flop raiser should be common for us after the flop goes check-check. Number 83, on more static flops or ones with very few draws, expect a short stack big blind to have very few strong hands on these boards and find very few check raises. So the one big blind c-bet will be very effective. Number 84, most high aggression post-flop lines during this phase of the tournament as we approach the bubble will be heavily underbluffed, even by a lot of pros. If they can't find any unintuitive or highly aggressive, ambitious bluffs, then they're probably going to end up underbluffing. Number 85, as the bubble approaches and ICM factors start to become more relevant, you shouldn't find yourself playing post-flop that often. If you end up getting in difficult post-flop spots around the bubble, it's probably because you're calling too much pre-flop. Number 86, most players will play relatively straightforwardly for a short time right after scoring a big double up or winning a huge pot. They're generally going to be caught up in the adrenaline rush of the big hand that just happened, and it'll take a moment for them to think clearly enough to run big bluffs or make complex adjustments. Number 87. The bulk of your opponents, even pros, won't necessarily recognize the need to decrease their post-flop aggression frequencies as we approach the bubble. They're supposed to check back the flop a lot more, check raise less often, and so on. But they may not actually do this. This means that we can apply additional pressure in certain cases, whether that's when we defend the big blind and they c-bet too much, or perhaps when we play back against their check raises. Number 88. Generally, players in this phase can be divided into two categories. It's going to be players who will over-adjust to the bubble by playing far too few hands if they're a middle or shorter stack, or by playing far too many hands if they're a big stack. And then you've got players who will under-adjust to the bubble and simply continue playing their standard strategy, which is something akin to a tighter version of a chip EV strategy. So there are going to be a couple of different categories we can pigeonhole people into once we get closer to the bubble. Number 89, don't limp in ICM scenarios outside of the small blind. It's not a good way of hedging against ICM pressure. It generally just leads to losing a lot of pots. I would only recommend trying it out if you've already done a lot of experimentation with ICM solvers like HRC to figure out the spots where it can actually be applicable. You can easily go without it in almost every spot. And finally, number 90. Expect our opponent's ranges to widen up dramatically after the bubble bursts. This is the only time in the tournament where players will likely be playing their short stacks too aggressively in some cases. They're often going to treat it like a free roll, where you'll sometimes see them shoving all in for 15 or 20 big blinds with hands that are wider than they should be, just because they think, I'm already in the money, now it's time to try to run up a stack. So your calling ranges in some spots can actually be wider than chip EV. Number 91. Recreational players will make a ton of mistakes in blind versus blind scenarios when stacks get a bit shorter, which they will in the later stages. They're going to tend to shove too often with strong hands, meaning we should fold to shoves a bit more often. And they're almost exclusively going to limp with middling hands, which means we can actually attack limps quite aggressively. Number 92. In particular, we should be mindful that recreational players and some pros will not necessarily recognize the value of being able to play in position from the big blind with certain hands versus a limp. So for example, they might shove all in with a hand like King Jack in a spot where you're actually not going to limp call the small blind or raise call the small blind with King 10 or King 9, but you're also not going to fold King Queen to a shove. So this will sometimes mean that their calling range against a raise is weaker than it should be and not very protected, but it's also going to mean that their shoving range will sometimes be stronger and a bit more linear than what it should be as well. So we should be a little bit more reluctant to raise call off. Number 93, however, we should be aware that some rec players will have a small blind limping range that you might call pseudo-polarized. It's composed of mostly middle hands that just want to see a flop, but it also contains a small number of very strong trapping hands. And it's not quite polarized because there's nothing weak in there. It's the very top and then the middle. And this can sometimes mean that raising small against a limp and letting them just shove with their traps and call their middle stuff can be better than jamming in some cases. Number 94, when playing limped pots blind against blind, expect recreational players to play very straightforwardly and heavily under bluff. They're largely going to underestimate the significance of fighting hard for the small pots in these cases. Number 95, the more risk-averse someone appears to be, the lower their bluffing frequencies are likely to be when deep in a tournament. However, once you reach the final table, some players will be satisfied with their current finish, so to speak, and will actually start opening up their game and trying to win a bit more aggressively. So as a result, the final 2 to 3 tables can sometimes play tighter and more conservatively than the final table, even though that's a mistake in most cases, because players will really want to make the final table, and once they get there, they feel like it's a free roll. Number 96, players who are obviously stalling once you reach pay jumps or the late stages of a tournament are also likely to be players who will play a more risk-averse style within each hand as well. Their ranges will be tighter and they're less likely to run bigger bluffs or take aggressive lines. Number 97, as ICM starts to take greater effect on our strategies, our overall bet sizing framework should size down. We'll be more inclined to forego big bet strategies on the flop, and spots which would usually be Overbet spots might become spots to use a catch-all sizing of 2/3 pot or 3/4 pot instead. Number 98, however, remember that ICM doesn't just mean you stop bluffing. We still have to play aggressively when ICM is in play. And taking pots down without showdown is an extremely important source of chips. You can't realistically hope to win a tournament only by having the best hand every time. Number 99, at many live final tables, you'll be able to find information about the names of your opponents somewhere online, Poker News or a similar news platform through the casino's social media accounts or somewhere like that. If this info is available, it's very important to search all your opponents on Hendon Mob or even just on Google before you start play, so you can make some assumptions about how they might be likely to approach the final table. If a player has never made a big final table before, they're probably going to be a bit more risk averse, and so on. Number 100, at a final table, you should rarely be shoving all in if there are still multiple active players who have you covered left behind. Raising 2/3 or 3/4 of your stack and leaving yourself room to fold and ladder up if there's a multi-way all-in can be extremely important and valuable. Number 101, players will often make the mistake of assuming that short-handed and full ring play are fundamentally different, when in fact they aren't. Being folded to on the button with 2 players in the blinds is the same spot, regardless of how many players folded before you acted. The only slight alteration is the distribution of cards left in the deck after players fold, which we refer to as the bunching effect, and which doesn't really change much about any spot. Number 102, in heads-up play, most recreational players will radically underdefend their big blind versus a small raise, so min-raising any 2 cards is generally a very good and very reliable approach. Number 103, with a big blind ante in play, you're going to want to almost never fold the button in heads-up play. If stacks are more than 15 big blinds deep, it should be never, and then once we get below 15 big blinds, you can start folding the bottom 5, maybe 10% of the deck. This is simply because the advantage of being in position on the button gets reduced as stack sizes are shallower, so the very bottom of the deck starts to become slightly unprofitable to limp or raise when you're less than 15 bigs. Number 104, just like on the bubble, you shouldn't be finding yourself playing post-flop that often in late game, heavy ICM scenarios, because ICM pressure decreases our desire to navigate multiple streets. So what you want is to make sure that you realize your equity by being all in pre-flop or being all in earlier in the hand, or you don't want to be in the hand at all. The worst case scenario is going post-flop in a circumstance where there's a ton of pressure on us and we can't bluff catch, and we just end up doing a lot of calling flop, folding turn, or calling flop, calling turn, folding river, and so on. Number 105. However, when you are the big stack, you can actually flat call a bit more often pre-flop, and your overall desire to play multiple streets post-flop can increase a lot. In fact, don't fall into the trap of just 3-betting a ton when you're the chip leader, because playing in position and playing post-flop can be a really powerful weapon there too. Number 106. In particular, your betting frequency should go up as the big stack, but your sizing should come down. Small bets at a high frequency is the way to go when you're able to put a lot of ICM pressure on your opponents. Number 107. In keeping with that last one, you can actually do a lot of flop donk betting as the chip leader to really apply pressure to the other stacks. This is especially true on board textures which are very favorable to your pre-flop range, such as middle card or lower card connected boards. Number 108. The downside of busting the tournament doesn't actually change mathematically according to ICM. We lose what's in our stack. The amount we lose is based on what the value of that stack was. What changes is the upside of winning chips. This means that we should always be very conscious of the payout structure as we get deeper into the event. The more top-heavy the structure, the more incentive we have to prioritize winning ahead of laddering up. Number 109. Most players will assume that a very equal stack distribution, for example, 5 players remaining and all 5 have between 20 and 25 big blinds, creates a heavy ICM effect. But this is not always the case. The presence of multiple short stacks, or even one very short stack, can actually be much more influential. But every ICM spot is different. So practice different kinds of spots and don't necessarily make too many assumptions about what the fundamental properties of the situation are. Always going to be different. Number 110. When playing heads up against a pro, a limp everything strategy from the button can be surprisingly effective. A lot of the appropriate adaptations to a limp all strategy at stacks of 20 to 40 big blinds aren't particularly intuitive. And limping a lot forces our opponent to play a lot of high SPR spots out of position with a very wide and very weak range. Number 111, your heads-up strategy shouldn't be restricted to push fold until you get down to around only 7 or 8 big blinds deep. It's still entirely justifiable to limp certain hands at shallow stacks in heads up, especially with a big blind ante. Number 112. In the later stages, you'll almost always want to be 3-betting to fairly small sizes with a range of hands that primarily contains an ace or a king blocker. In fact, if you never 3-bet in an ICM spot without at least one ace or king in your hand, or a value hand like queens or jacks, you'd probably be doing fine. Number 113. Against stronger opponents who understand the value of 3-betting with blockers, 4-bet jamming with suited ace hands like ace-5 suited can actually be worse than you'd think. Because if the majority of their 3-bet bluffs are ace blocker hands, then you're actually blocking their bluffs when you have an ace. Instead, consider suited Broadway hands like king-jack suited, king-10 suited, or queen-jack suited as potentially valuable 4-bet jam hands. Number 114. Calling 3-bets in ICM-heavy situations is quite often disincentivized. However, this effect is slightly neutralized when there are no significant short stacks. If you get short-handed and nobody is in danger of busting, you'll have to continue fighting hard to win pots. Number 115. When you're short-stacked on the button heads up, your limping range should be composed of very strong hands, which are trapping, and very weak hands, which are folding to a shove, while your shoving range should be everything in the middle. If you're not sure what you would do against a shove, your hand is probably a jam, not a limp. Number 116. When facing a limp heads up, your raising range from the big blind should be quite polarized, and your sizing should be large, larger than you would usually employ against a limp in full ring play at short stacks. Start with a size of 5 big blinds if stacks are 40 bigs or greater, and decrease your size slightly as they get shallower. Number 117. When the player in the big blind is the chip leader or has you substantially covered, your open raise sizing should be slightly larger, up to 2.5 big blinds or even 3 big blinds in extreme cases. This is because you want to shrink the post-flop SPR against these players so that their overall ICM advantage, or risk advantage as we might call it, is less meaningful against you. Number 118. A good rule of thumb for ICM spots is that passive action is disincentivized, while aggressive action is more incentivized. This means that raising and re-raising on earlier streets have more value, while navigating into the later streets is a little less advantageous. This means that not only does 3-betting pre-flop often have more value than calling, but small flop raises and check raises can also be very beneficial in the right spots. Number 119. Against players who are not very ICM aware, we can't fall into the same trap of playing the way that they do. We still have to follow the principles of ICM because we're playing against the entire field, not against one specific player. So don't let a certain player's weaknesses cause you to make a mistake that doesn't fit your incentives. And finally, number 120. It's very difficult to make changes to our strategy based on the expectation of a future skill edge in most cases, because it's really hard to estimate accurately how big our edge is and how that applies to different spots. But the exception is when there are players at our table who are significant outliers. For example, a player who's playing an excessively tight strategy and who's going to allow us to pick up a lot more pots uncontested than what we're supposed to. Or a player with an extremely volatile style who might be more likely to punt off their stack unexpectedly and allow us to get an extra pay jump. Those are things we can account for with a little bit more accuracy. But if everybody around us is playing pretty normally or pretty decently, it's really hard to factor skill edge into the equation. So that is going to wrap it up for our 120 tips and exploits for live MTTs. I hope you guys have got a ton of value, and I can assure you, you're going to see much more content from me in your inbox coming soon. And until then, if you guys have any questions or comments, I'll be available through all the usual social media platforms, particularly Instagram. If you drop me a DM on Instagram at PokerFluency, I will be more than happy to discuss all this content with you. So until next time, everyone, good luck at the tables, and thank you very much for watching.